Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Accelerate webinar, everything you always wanted to know about drug development for children with cancer, but were afraid to ask up till now. I am Gilles Vassal, the chair of the Accelerate platform, and with the Accelerate team, we are extremely pleased to welcome you. This is the first ever educational event by Accelerate. This is really for those who have been afraid so far to ask questions. This is the day, this is your day. Feel free to ask any question that you would have. We are not regulators. We are not from industry. This is what we know about the topics, and we are very keen to share with you. During the presentation, please use the Q&A on the bottom of your screen to ask for any question or to vote for questions which have been already asked. After the webinar, the recording will be made available on the Accelerate website. This has been brought to you by the Accelerate team, and during the presentation, Teresa and Michael will help me to really share with you what we wanted to share with you. Andy will be watching and capturing all your questions and will be chairing the Q&A session at the end. And Andrea will be in the background, assuring that everything is okay. And by the way, he is the one who made the playlist. So we planned 4 chapters for this webinar. The first one is who is who and who does what. The second one is why children are underserved. The fourth will be regulations try to help. Was it successful? And finally, how does the future look like? During the webinar, we will ask you several times to answer a question. This is a way of interaction we wanted really to set up for this, this session. And we would like to start with asking you who you are. Oops. Are you patients, parents, advocates? Are you clinicians, researchers from academia, less than 40 years old or older than 40 years old? Are you from industry? Are you from regulatory network or any other? Please start voting. You have 10 seconds. Thank you. So 28% from industry. I'm not sure we will teach you many, but you are absolutely welcome. 13% of parents and clinicians younger than 40, welcome, and all the other welcome as well. The next question we would like to ask you is where you are from. North America, South America, Africa, Asia, Europe, Oceania, Antarctica, and other. Is there any other country, other continent? I don't know. You have 10 seconds to vote. Please do. Great. 2/3 from Europe, 1/3 from North America. Let's now go into, the first chapter, who is who does what? To address this, I thought it was important to remind us all together how a drug becomes a medicine that can be prescribed. First, there is the drug discovery part, thousands of compounds which are being evaluating at the preclinical level through preclinical research and testing. Then the molecule enters the clinical development in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And if all these data provide some interesting results, they are submitted for a marketing authorization to competent authorities. For 10 drugs entering drug development in adults, only one, as an average, becomes a medicine approved. After the approval, there is a post-marketing surveillance, which is important because at the time the drug is prescribed to many more patients than the number of patients who participate to clinical trial. And it is very important to make surveillance to watch what is happening to the drug in the real life. In some countries, such as in Europe, there is an additional level of evaluation to identify what would be the price of the drug and how much it would be reimbursed. So the competent authorities are the one evaluating medicinal products for the delivery of marketing authorization. There are more than 200 competent authorities around the world. What do? They evaluate the quality of the product and the manufacturing process. They evaluate the safety and efficacy data. And they evaluate the benefit-risk ratio for patients who would be treated with this medicine for the disease, the indication. Where are they? You all know them. In the US, this is the Food and Drug Administration. In Europe, this is the European Medicine Agency. In the UK, this is MHRA. In Australia, it's TGA. In Japan, it's PMDA. In China, it's CTNA. And in Canada, it is Health Canada. In Europe, the European Medicine Agency works with each national competent authorities in the European Union and related countries. And you see that is really a network working together to evaluate medicine for marketing authorization and of course, many other activities on this topic. So we need to know that really progress for better regulation to really assure the safety and efficacy of the medicine that are proposed to the patient have been made over the last 100 years through scandals. The first one was the elixir sulfanilamide scandal in 1937. This is antibiotic, which the company dissolved using the diethylene glycol as a sweetening solvent. And you all know that diethylene glycol, it's used for its antifreeze properties. It was proposed to patients, including children, and more than 100 children and adults died because they took elixir sulfanilamide with diethylene glycol, mainly for sore throats. Based on that, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act was enacted in the US, asking for safety, but not yet for efficacy for each drug approval. The next important scandal, as you know, was the thalidomide scandal in the 60s. Thalidomide was a drug prescribed to pregnant women as anti-morning sickness. And from 1957 to 1962, more than 10,000 babies were born with physical abnormalities. The most frequent one being phocomelia, which is missing of shortening limbs, as you saw on the screen. This ended up with a profound change in the regulation about drugs and drug approval in the US, in Europe, where effectiveness had to be demonstrated through adequate and well-controlled studies, including a strong pharmacovigilance program to be vigilant of what's happening with new medicine prescribed. Interestingly, as you know, the thalidomide was approved in 2008 for the treatment of multiple myeloma, but no longer used at all for morning sickness in pregnant women. Finally, who is the HTA? Well, I told you before that the price and reimbursement, especially in Europe, is evaluated by health Technology Assessment, the HTA agencies. How does it work? They look at the cost effectiveness of the new medicine with regard to what is proposed to the patients when they are treated. They look at the impact of on the budget, on the healthcare budget at the national level. They look at the seriousness of the disease to propose a price and a reimbursement scheme. Interestingly, you need to know that there is not one single HTA agency in Europe, as it is for the competent authority, the EMA, but one per country. And there are discrepancies explaining why a drug is not available at once in all countries at the same time. So from now on, we propose to focus on the evaluation and authorization of medicine for children. And let's move to the next chapter. The next chapter is how underserved are children.
So to kick off this very interesting part of the webinar, we're going to ask you a question. As you know, carboplatin is one of the most used drugs in standard treatment in pediatric oncology. In fact, I guess that a lot of you have prescribed it already in clinical practice. So which of the following answers is true? A, its pediatric use was approved in 1998 by the FDA and in 1999 by the EMA. B, the pediatric dose recommendations have been well established and sanctioned by the competent authorities. C, carboplatin has no approved pediatric indication and therefore is prescribed only off-label. Or D, there are few data available regarding safety, effectiveness, and dose recommendations in children. So which of these is true? You have 10 seconds. Perfect. Back to you, Gilles, to find out which one is the correct one.
Thank you, Teresa. So carboplatin is used off-label in pediatric oncology, even in March 2021. If you look at the summary of product characteristics, which summarize all the information for a product, the leaflets present in the drug package, you will find for paraplatin, this information, safety and effectiveness in pediatric patients have not been established. And this is true for all the generics of carboplatin. Carboplatin is used off-label. But then, if you look to PubMed, and you enter that item, carboplatin, cancer, and children, you will find more than 1,400 papers. And if you look at pharmacokinetics, it will be 110. So despite this drug is used off-label, safety, effectiveness, and those recommendations have been well established in children through academic clinical research run by cooperative groups without pharmaceutical companies.
Okay, so let's look at what you replied. And indeed, you already know a lot. 61% of you replied the correct answer, which is that carboplatin has no approved pediatric indication and we can only prescribe it off-label. And as you learned by Professor Vassal, there are a lot of data available regarding safety, effectiveness, and those recommendations that have been produced by academia. Knowing this, we want to ask you a second question about carboplatin, which is, should companies selling carboplatin be obliged to submit data for marketing authorization for the treatment of pediatric malignancies? What do you think? Do you think yes, they should? Do you think they should not? Or you don't know? You have 10 seconds again. Perfect. Back to you, Gilles.
So 58% of you think that we should oblige companies to submit the data to have a full approval, and 23% should think we should not. Well, actually, do we care having a paper saying that we can prescribe carboplatin to pediatric malignancies, that we do know the dose, that we do have the evidence that it is efficacious? From a pediatric oncology point of view, we say no. There should not be any resources dedicated to this amount of work needed just to put words in a document that we don't need. These resources should be better used for the development of innovative compounds. But this could be, of course, discussed later on. So, carboplatin off-label. When the European Commission launched the initiative on the pediatric regulation, they made this important statement. More than 50% of the medicines used for children in any specialty had not been tested for use in this specific age group. And this is why, since 1994, there have been several initiatives to really improve and provide a better medicine for children. And the next part, the next chapter will address this regulation to understand how they work. So they tried to help. Was it a success? Since 1994, there has been a regulation encouraging pharmaceutical companies to submit data, but it did not work very well, especially in the US. So then there was a new concept, which is let's provide a carrot and a stick. And this is why in 2002, in the US, the Best Pharmaceutical for Children Act was passed. It is a regulation that provides a financial incentive to companies to voluntarily conduct pediatric studies. And if they do, they get a reward, so-called pediatric exclusivity. In 2002, the stick was proposed at the PREA, Pediatric Research Equity Act. It means that due to the regulation, there is a requirement for a company to assess the safety and effectiveness of new drugs or biologics in pediatric patients for disease occurring both in adults and children. And this is very important. And this excluded as well orphan drugs. So this one, BPCA, is voluntary. This one is mandatory. In 2006, Europe launched the pediatric regulation inspired by what happened in the US in the years before. And it's joining the carrot and the stick. Obligation, rewards, incentive to encourage manufacturers to evaluate their compound in children to address their specific therapeutic needs. As you know, the instrument is a PIP, Pediatric Investigation Plan, and the reward is also an extension of the patent by 6 months. So what are the big principles of these regulations? First, a pediatric development plan, a PIP in Europe, a PSP in the US, that contains all the studies, non-clinical studies and clinical studies that are needed to evaluate whether a drug is effective in a disease in children. And this needs to be granted at the time the company is filing the data for marketing authorization in adults, unless a waiver is granted, which means that the company doesn't have to develop the medicine in children. First, because it's likely to be ineffective or unsafe, which is absolutely common sense. Second, disease is occurring only in adults. And third, there is no significant therapeutic benefits that can be expected over existing treatment, which is also common sense. In addition, the regulation says you can delay the start of pediatric evaluation, the so-called deferral, because of any reason, including there is not enough data in adults to start. So next step is how the Best Pharmaceutical for Children Act works. This regulation, which is voluntary and proposing for companies doing that, reward the pediatric exclusivity. So please stay tuned and focus. It may look complicated, but it could be probably easy to understand. This is what we try to do with this animated slide. The instrument of the BPCA is a written request. It contains the studies to be done in children. This written request is issued by the Food and Drug Administration to the sponsor. A sponsor can ask the Food and Drug Administration to issue a written request. In this case, the sponsor make a PPSR, proposed pediatric study request, to the FDA, which is then issuing a written request. The written request is an option for the company to voluntarily conduct studies in children. They can say no, or they can develop the studies in a written request. And if they do, if the studies are completed, whatever the results are, whether it is positive or negative, they can get the pediatric exclusivity. They can get the reward. This is the voluntary part of the US regulation proposing reward to companies voluntarily developing drugs in pediatric disease, not only malignancies. So, having that in mind, we have a question for you. Whoops, that was a little mistake. Yes, do it.
Right. So, taking this into account, we want to test your knowledge again. So we ask you the question, under the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, what is the most correct answer? Is it A, a written request is issued by the FDA? B, a written request contains studies for only one indication? C, a company cannot ask a written request? Or D, a PREA requirement and a written request can be issued for the same medicinal product? You have 10 seconds starting now.
And multiple choice is possible. So the countdown doesn't work, so I will count down. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 2, 1, stop.
All right, show them the result, Jill.
So you are absolutely right. The written request is issued by the FDA. And indeed, a company can ask both a written request and a PREA for a company. I'm sorry, but this is, yeah. But the written request can contain several indications, not only one clinical study. And of course, a company can ask for a written request. Sorry for the confusion, sorry for the telephone, but we will move definitely on this one. So if we look at the data, and if you look on the FDA website, you find this new pediatric labeling information database that contains all medicines that had new pediatric labeling thanks to the regulation. And you look at, as April 2020, it's 854 compounds which have been which have got new pediatric labeling. And as you can see, for 131, it has been both through BPCA and PREA. So a company can really get the PREA stick and the PPCA voluntary for a compound when developing in children. So let's finish with this part of the chapter with the reward, because you may be a little bit interesting to better understand how this reward works. In the US, it is called the pediatric exclusivity, which is an extension of the patent of the drug. In Europe, it is called extension of the supplementary protection certificate, which is pretty much the same concept. In both, this is 6-month extension. And it is important to have in mind that it concerns the marketing of a company in all its indications, not only in children. So how does it work? it means that there is an additional period of premium revenue for the compound and the company, and a delayed competition with generics. If we look how it works, when a drug is approved, a drug is sold, there is revenue for the company, and for a period of time with exclusivity, 7 plus years. At the end, then the generics are proposed and enter the market. The revenue of the drug decrease, the revenue of the generics increase. With an additional 6 months, it means that the entry of the generics is delayed by 6 months, which means that the first drug is being continued to be sold as it was for the 7 years. And then it provides an additional revenue thanks to the 6 months extension. So we tried to figure out how much it was and how attractive it was. And the only information we found was in the economic assessment of the 10-year report of the European regulation, where 8 products were granted a reward for a total of 936 million euros. So we have a question for you.
Right. So this is more of a question for your opinion. Is the reward attractive for the pharmaceutical industry? Yes, no, it depends, or you don't know. You have 10 seconds starting now. All right, then I'm passing the word again to Professor Vazal to show the results.
Indeed, the answer is not univoc, of course, depending if you are an industry, if you are a health system, depending very much where you stand. And clearly, it depends is clearly the right answer. Can be considered as too much or not enough for any people around the table, but at least it exists. And all this really generated over the last years more evaluation of medicine in children. And this is the next topic that we would like to address. Was it a success? Was it a success for children to have better medicines evaluated in the US and in Europe? The answer is yes, when the disease is the same in adults and children. Just look at a figure from the European report on the pediatric regulation, a significant increase over time. This was a success for rheumatology. This was a success for infectious disease. But clearly it was not working for neonatology. Obvious, there are no adult diseases in neonates, but also for pediatric oncology. And why? Well, the reason is evident and it was anticipated before the regulation was set up. The malignancies are different in adults and children, even though they may share the same targets. For example, BRAF is mutated in melanoma, which is mainly an adult disease, and BRAF is mutated in low-grade glioma, which is mainly a pediatric disease. But we use the same medicine because we consider rather the mechanism of action than the adult indication. But you understood from the US and European regulation that the concept consider that if the malignancy is not existing in children, then the company gets a waiver and doesn't have to develop the medicine in children. And in addition to this issue of indication, there have been too many deferrals with regard to the development of pediatric malignancies. So just a few examples to show you. To address the issue of waiver, there have been lists of diseases not occurring or rarely in children that have been issued by the FDA, by the EMA. And it was important because it meant that there was no need for a pharma to justify that the product to treat such a disease would need epidemiological data and demonstrating that, of course, it does not exist in children. So through this list, waiver were automatically granted. This is the current class waiver list or automatic waivers in the US. You see the numbers, and for example, there is Alzheimer's disease. Well, there is no Alzheimer's disease in children, and lung cancer. There is no lung cancer in children. In Europe, such a list was issued at the very beginning in 2008, revised several times. The last revision was in 2015, trying to improve this class waiver list. But this really caused damage or no development for many drugs in children. And I would like to illustrate that to share with you the ALK inhibition story that most of you may know. In 1994, the ALK gene, ALK for anaplastic lymphoma kinase, was discovered as a hallmark of this lymphoma, anaplastic large cell lymphoma, occurring both in adults and children. It was found altered in lung cancer, in a rare soft tissue sarcoma, IMT, and in a very specific pediatric tumor, neuroblastoma. In 2011, the first anti-ALK inhibitor, the first ALK inhibitor, sorry, was approved for the treatment of lung cancer, ALK-positive lung cancer. In 2011 in the US and in 2012 in Europe. Under the PRIA, under the pediatric regulation, a waiver was issued for the development of crizotinib in children on the ground that lung cancer does not occur in children. The company did not develop the drug. But the pediatric oncologists found that, well, the target is really oncogenic and important for this disease. This drug is quite interesting, with quite interesting results in adults. We should clearly evaluate. And academic pediatric development with several clinical trials have been run with more than 200 patients who could participate, showing the activity of crizotinib in these malignancies. And the good news is that last January 14, 2021, these data generated by academia were submitted by the company to the Food and Drug Administration, and an authorization for the use of crizotinib in anaplastic large cell lymphoma was granted. In Europe, there is a pediatric investigation plan up and running for ILCL and IMT. And in the next months, it's pretty sure that we will have also, we hope, an authorization for children using crizotinib. So if you look at this slide, it's been 10 years. 10 years in between the first marketing authorization of crizotinib in adults and the first marketing authorization of crizotinib in children, due to a waiver. And we say this is a scientifically and medically unjustified waiver. It means that for all these 10 years, the only possibility for children to have access to crizotinib was through clinical trials. And we know that clinical trials are not available everywhere, which means that maybe patients did not get access to crizotinib and did not benefit from it and died. This is what needs to be addressed to improve and accelerate the development of pediatric medicine for children with cancer. Just a word on late onset. This is just the illustration of nivolumab and pembrolizumab that you know, the checkpoint inhibitor, the first of a long series of new immunotherapy, which has been first approved for the treatment of melanoma in the US in 2014, in the Europe in 2015, after 4 to 6 years development in adults. Interestingly, the pediatric development of these two compounds started only early 2015, where the drug was already approved in adults, which means that time was lost. Instead of looking at the evaluation in children before marketing authorization, to have the information as soon as possible, is it working or not? The delay in this was such that the pediatric development was at the time of the drug already approved. So if we summarize, why the regulation failed? First, because they were drug-centric and not patient-centric, looking at the unmet needs. Second, they were driven by the adult indication rather than the mechanism of action, the target, and the patient needs. And finally, there has been too many delays in starting pediatric development that generating too often a situation that the clinical trial started when the drug was already marketed and losing time for patients. So
with all of this in mind, we want to test your knowledge again with two questions. The first one is, how many new medicines or new indications have been authorized in the US and in the EU between 2008 and 2019 in childhood cancers, so over the last decade? Is it less than 20 drugs, 20 to 40, or more than 40? And the second question is exactly the same for cancers in adults. So how many new drugs or indications have been authorized over the last decade for cancers in adults? Is it less than 50, 50 to 150, or more than 150? You have 10 seconds to answer both now. Perfect. Back to Gilles.
So you got the right answer. Over a period running from 2008 and 2019, 18 anti-cancer medicines have been approved, new molecular entities for use in children. 15 in the US, 12 in Europe, and 10 in both. And for the adults, it is estimated that more than 150 anti-cancer medicine have been approved, illustrating the explosion of new medicine for children, for adults, sorry, but not enough for children. So if we go rapidly of what are these medicines, 2 anti-cancer drugs for the treatment of neuroblastoma, a monoclonal antibody against anti-GD2 in Europe, in US. Only 1 drug has been approved in a different indication in adults and children. This is everolimus for the treatment of renal cell carcinoma in adults, for the treatment of subependymal giant cell ependymoma, a very rare brain tumor in children. The majority were drugs approved in a disease occurring both in adults and children. On the left-hand side, there are the disease I will not go through. You will be looking at that later on. And if you look at the time in between first marketing authorization in adults and in children, some of them have been at the same time, especially the most recently approved entrectinib, larotrectinib as so-called agnostic indications. But some of them have been approved with a time from 2.5 years up to 70.3 years between marketing authorization. This is where we need to accelerate. If there are other regulations that are of interest for childhood cancer, indeed, there are other regulations, the so-called orphan drug regulation in the US, in Japan, in Europe, with the definition of a rare disease, fewer than 200,000 people in the US, fewer than 1 in 2,000 people in the EU. We won't go into the detail today, but the message is, even though each pediatric malignancy is rare, orphan regulation did not work well for childhood cancer. So finally, in the next minute, how does the future look like? First of all, I would like to share with you another piece of regulation which has been set up in 2012, really to help developing new medicine for rare disease in children. This is so-called Creating Hope, which is providing a priority review voucher for companies who are developing medicine against rare pediatric diseases. How does it work? A company develops a drug A against a rare pediatric disease. If it is successful and they get a marketing authorization, then a priority review voucher is awarded. A priority review voucher is a voucher that helps that make the FDA reducing the time to evaluate a drug from an average of 10 months to less than 6 months. So what the company can do with this priority review voucher, it can use it for a next compound in the pipeline, reducing the time of evaluation by FDA, or it can be sold to another company for another drug. And the drug is not necessarily a drug for children, can be any type of drugs. So did it work? Since 2012, there has been 28 vouchers awarded, 4 in oncology. At this one, the first one, dinutuximab for the treatment of iris neuroblastoma. And this voucher was sold for $350 million to AbbVie, and AbbVie used it for the evaluation of upadacitinib compound, upadacitinib, to treat rheumatoid arthritis in adults. And when all the review vouchers are looked at for those being sold, they have been sold for a median of 110 million euros. So this is a regulation which really helped to develop first in children, and the issue of how it can be expanded is really an important issue. Finally, this is the RACE Act, and you all know the RACE Act that was passed in 2017, that entered into force in 2020, and clearly this is a modification of the PRIE, and you do remember the PRIE is the stick, the requirement for evaluation of drugs when the disease is the same in adults and children. So what does RACE say? It requires pediatric evaluation of new molecular targets or biologics that are intended to treat an adult cancer and which are directed at a molecular target substantially relevant to the growth of progression of a pediatric cancer. What does it mean? It means that now we look at the mechanism of action, we look at the target and no longer at the disease. In 2021, under RACE, crizotinib would not be waived because lung cancer does not exist, but would be asked to develop a pediatric plan because ALK is an important biological target in several pediatric malignancies related to the growth or progression. And this is why this regulation is likely to really change the landscape. You will tell me what happened in Europe? Well, Europe is working and will be launching at the end of the year its European Pharmaceutical Strategy. I won't go into the detail, but be informed that there will be a revision of the pediatric medicine and orphan regulation to really try to address several of the issues we have been discussing today. So we have a final question for you. Will the new regulation environment we just described accelerate the development of safe and effective anti-cancer drugs for treatment of cancer in children and adolescents? You have 10 seconds. Thank you. So it's good. Almost 50% of you said yes, and I think you are right. And 40% of you would need more information, and I think this is really, really relevant. And this is where clearly we finish the talk, because I would like to ask Titus, who was a little lion in the French TV movies in the 60s, who was ending all its episodes by this, ça, c'est une autre histoire, which means this is another story. And we will be very pleased to tell you this other story about the future in the next webinar that we will propose in June. And before wrapping up, or as a wrap up, we would like just to propose a clinical case, and I will hand over to Teresa, who will propose this clinical case. Teresa?
Thank you, Gilles. So we want to challenge you a bit with everything that you have learned today. So we're proposing the following clinical case. First, you have to know that minionblastoma is an embryonal tumor that only occurs in children, predominantly at the age of 5 to 10 years. Standard of care frontline treatment includes surgery, combination chemo, and radiotherapy. And it achieves a 5-year survival rate of 55%. However, rescue therapy after relapse is not well established, and it has a very poor prognosis with a 5-year survival of less than 10%. You should also know that GRU is a gene that is mutated in up to 25% of all non-small cell lung cancer patients. So this is an exciting target that is being currently investigated by several pharma companies. GRU is additionally a driver gene that is mutated in up to 78% of all meningoblastoma patients. So there is one company in particular, Nefario Pharmaceuticals, that has developed a GRU inhibitor called grunitinib, and this has already been successfully explored in clinical trials. The most recent one finalized as a phase 2 trial. So this company, Nefario Pharmaceuticals, wants to apply for market authorization with this indication, so for lung cancer patients, adult patients, both at the FDA and the EMA. So with all of this in mind, we have a few questions for you. The first one is whether you think that grunitinib should be investigated for the treatment of meningoblastoma. Do you think, no, meningoblastoma already has a well-established frontline treatment with high survival rates? No, the minimum cost effectiveness standards are not met to develop this drug in meningoblastoma? No, grunitinib does not need to be investigated for this indication, so it should be used in children with meningoblastoma right away, off-label. Or yes, this is a potential indication that should be explored, beginning with a first-in-child clinical trial. So what do you think? You have 10 seconds to answer. Perfect. Let's see the results. Well, this is excellent. As you see, most of you replied what we wanted you to reply, which is, yes, this is a potential indication that should be explored in the frame of clinical trials in children as well. Okay, so we move on to the next question. We want to imagine, for you to imagine that you are the company owning the compound. So you are part of Nefario Pharmaceuticals. In that case, what regulatory process would be mandatory for you to submit in the USA under the RACE Act? Would you need to submit an IPSP, a PPSR, a waiver, a PIP, or none of them are actually mandatory? You have again 10 seconds.
Okay, yes, you are right. Under RACE, because the target is substantially relevant for meningoblastoma, there is a need to submit before, at the end of phase 2 in adults, the pediatric investigation plan, an IPSP, for evaluation by the FDA. The PPSR is not mandatory. The waiver is not relevant. PIP is not in the US.
Perfect. So we have a third and last question for you about this clinical case, which is similar as the last one, but for the EU. So what will need to be granted at the time of filing in adults in the EU? Would you need to be granted an IPSP, a PPSR, a waiver, a PIP, or none of them are actually mandatory? You have, again, 10 seconds and you can answer. There's multiple answers possible in this question. Excellent, thank you.
Well, thank you, Teresa. The situation is a little bit more complex in Europe. Under the current regulation, a drug can still be waived if the disease in children is not the same as in adults. Article 11B. So a company can voluntarily submit a pediatric investigation plan. They are not mandated, but they can do it voluntarily. On the other hand, they can still ask for a waiver. A waiver will be a specific waiver due to the modification of the class waiver list, but the company could still ask for a waiver. And this is why we hope that the revision will clarify the situation and say, well, the target is relevant for pediatric malignancies, the drug should be developed in children. So having said that, we can move to the Q&A, and thank you so far for your attention. We appreciate very much. Andy, I give you the microphone. What did happen in the Q&A?
Yeah, well, I think we have 21 questions. I think is not feasible to address in approximately 5 minutes. So we will try and address as many as we can online. But what I propose is when we circulate the recordings, we will answer the others. So the first question is, does a successful completion of a PIP or a PSP to get the reward mean that the clinical study showed a success?
Well, to be clear, to trigger the reward, it means that the evaluation is completed. If the result of the phase 2 trial is negative, the drug is not active in children, but it has been well defined, the company can claim and obtain the reward. So the rewarding program is not linked to the successful development in terms of activity of the compound, but to the completion of the development plans granted by the agencies.
So the next question is, in the 7 years of pediatric exclusivity, when do companies normally apply for a PIP?
Well, the companies are asked to submit their PIP before the drug is marketed. And they are asked by the regulation to do that at the end of the phase 1 trial in adults, in order to start the development when relevant. The issue of the time is very important, because if the pediatric development starts late, considering the time to do it, the risk is that it cannot be completed before the SPC is finished. And this is sometimes an important item to consider, that the companies consider, whether or not there will be time to develop and finalize the plan before the end of the SPC. This is why we tell company, come early to us, come early to define whether a drug is relevant and start as soon as possible. It will be good for you as a company, but also for the patient to get access to the medicine in development.
And the follow-up question to that, should there be or are there any incentives for earlier submission of a PIP in that 7-year period?
That's a brand new question. And this is an open question in the so-called, at the moment, revision or plan revision in Europe. What different reward can be provided? At the moment, it's only a reward at the end of the 7 years, very late. Can there be some part of the waiver issued earlier to reward early evaluation? And this is clearly at the moment not feasible, but clearly a topic to be discussed in preparation of the revision of the regulation in Europe.
And the next question is, if issues have been raised regarding the waivers and that they are not performing as they should do, why haven't they been altered?
Oh, could you address this one for me?
Yeah, yes. So I think this is really one of the key opportunities. So as we know, the pediatric medicines regulation has now been in force since for over a decade. And the next year really is a critical period when they are asking for input, the European Commission, about how to redesign it. And very importantly, they want it to be redesigned in collaboration, in conjunction with the orphans regulation. So really now is the time that we can try and alter this. And Europe, parents' organization, CCI, are putting forward very clear plans of how this can be addressed. The next question is, why would a company voluntarily submit a PIP if they can avoid it? What would be the benefit for them?
So I see two main reasons. If the company would be interested by the 6-month extension of for the entire indication of the compound, but also more and more companies are willing really to develop a pediatric program to address the need of the patient. This is why clearly this is a voluntary approach. And in the past, we had companies who did develop pediatric investigation plan voluntarily without in diseases that were not occurring in children. So these are the main two reasons I would see. And more companies are really willing to develop a quite scientifically and medically driven development of their portfolio in pediatric malignancies.
So as I said, that we have now approximately 25 questions. So those that we haven't answered, we will definitely answer when we circulate the recording. Thank you all.
Okay. Thank you, Andy. So this is the end of the webinar. Maybe it was too long, not enough time for discussion. We will improve next time. I would like to thank you very much for attending. I would like to thank also Andrew McDonough, Be Positive Foundation, and Joe McDonough. He is a very strong support to Accelerate, and I wanted to thank him very much today. The recording of this will be available very soon on the webinar. Tomorrow you will receive an evaluation form. Please fill it up if you wish. That would be really useful. And finally, we would like to tell you that we plan to have a second one because we may think that you may find this interesting. And the second one is likely to happen in June 15, 2021. So without further ado, with all the team, we would like very much to thank you. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your question. More to come. This was the first event by Accelerate. You tell us if it was sufficiently good to continue and make another one. And without that, we would like to thank you and tell you have a good morning, evening, afternoon, night, and stretch your legs, have a drink or a cup of tea, whatever you would like. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.